This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. Today's guest is one of my favorite people in the entire Pharmaverse, Michael Geffner. Now let me introduce him before we start talking to him. So Michael Geffner is an MD, MBA, with nearly 25 years in the industry. He's led clinical operations, clinical development, and medical affairs. So a very unique and well-rounded leadership experience. And I've placed several people with him over the years, and every single one of them have told me that Michael Geffner is by far the best leader that they've ever worked with. So we're extremely fortunate that he's here to share his leadership insights with us. So Michael Geffner, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You bet. I mean, you were the first person that came to my mind, actually, when I started this. Remember that call?
Yeah, no, but I'm glad to help.
All right. Well, hey, yeah, I am too. And, you know, just I thought we should start off by talking about your time at Schering-Plough.
Okay.
Because you ended up leading global clinical operations, and that is such a great story, not only about bravery on your part, but also the leadership decision that was made to put you into that role. So can you share that story with us?
Sure. I hope it's interesting to others, but glad to tell it. So when I was in clinical development, I was in hepatology as a therapeutic area, and I'm a neurologist by training and pediatrician. So that's a story for another day, but you know the key message there from my perspective is not to be afraid to stretch yourself and step outside of what you're comfortable with and what you've trained in or what you've done before. But I was in clinical development. I was basically a clinical monitor. That's usually the term that is in most pharmaceutical companies. And I had been working my way up the chain to leading an individual study, to leading programs, to leading other physicians leading programs, but all in the clinical development space. And I had always told our management that I thought we weren't set up from an organizational structure perspective for success. And what I meant by that was each therapeutic area had its own cohort of employees, project managers, CRAs, field monitors, physicians, you name it, which was great because it gave the person who led that therapeutic area a lot of flexibility and a lot of control. But the problem with that was it was very limiting, very restrictive. So if you had a therapeutic area that was becoming hot and you needed to accelerate, or you wanted to accelerate, the only way to do that was to get approval to hire more people. And then once you did that, the time that it takes to identify those people, train them, et cetera, and have them on board, it was a missed opportunity. And the other therapeutic areas didn't necessarily share resources. So if they weren't busy, they weren't exactly lending their folks to others. So I was always saying that I thought we needed, a core group that could be trained in one or two therapeutic areas and work flexibly across. And we got a new president of the research division. And one day my phone rang, and he asked me to come up to his office at 5 p.m. On a Wednesday. So I thought for sure I was going upstairs to get fired by somebody I never met. And because that was my boss's boss's boss at the time. So if you can imagine, what goes through your mind when that happens. But I went upstairs and, I barely got to sit down and he said, I understand you think we're organized improperly. And I said, well, I wouldn't say improperly. And he says, no, it's not right. And I've thought that since I got here. And he took out a piece of paper with a brand new organizational chart. With no names in the boxes, but roles and a structure. And he said, what do you think about this structure? And I said, well, I'm not sure why you're asking me, but I think it's great. I mean, that's exactly along the lines of what I've been proposing to my management. And he said, well, we heard you. And, the good news is I'm putting this structure in place. The other good news is an all hands meeting tomorrow. And by the way, this top box here is you. So we want to. So that's how I was asked whether I wanted to leave clinical development to start what became clinical operations at Schering-Plough. And we started small. We started with North America, which included the US and Canada. And we built it from the ground up. And essentially, once we put that structure in place, we were able to execute about 20% more portfolio with the same people, working flexibly across therapeutic areas and across projects, but with people maintaining core expertise and experience so that we could deliver the kind of quality that we wanted to deliver. And then when that worked, the company decided to globalize that. So I stayed on and led North America. They brought in someone who led global operations, but I led North America. I led Europe for a while. And then actually when Merck bought Schering-Plough, they liked the model and adopted that model, the Schering model, which is pretty unusual for an acquiring company to take that step, but they did. And the one thing I would say is that in that whole process, there were two key people that really propelled that idea forward, and me in particular. And one was my boss's boss, Tom Havardy, who's an amazing guy and if you don't know Tom, and a lot of people do, he's a brilliant mind, but he could distill that complexity down to very simple principles and talking points where he could explain that to not even your teenager, but somebody in, elementary school. So that was a unique skill to be able to take really complicated things, make them simple, make them relatable. He was a great storyteller, and he had absolutely no ego. He didn't care who got the credit, and he really built up his team. And he had an eye for talent. And one of the things that he did routinely, not just with me, but with others, was he wasn't afraid to stretch people and move them into things that he thought they'd be great at, but they never did before. And if you ever read the book, Who Moved My Cheese, which is one of my all-time favorite books, he was definitely a cheese mover. And he's the one who pushed me to do operations and in addition to what I had done in clinical, and got his boss, who was the president of the research institute, Tom Kessler, who was also a brilliant, great guy, to offer me the opportunity to take that role. So
what a story. So at the peak there, how many people were in that organization?
At the peak, it was north of 400. So it's about 430 people between the U.S. and Canada. Wow. That was after Schering-Plough had acquired Organon Biosciences, and then after the acquisition of Schering-Plough by Merck. It was roughly 425 people.
Well, we'll circle back to Tom in a minute, but first, when you were at Merck, there was another mentor that you had there too, a mentor that we have shared. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Ken Massey, he was unfortunately an amazing human, and I'll tell you a little story about Ken because it's not dissimilar to the story that I had with Tom Kessler in the president's office with a blank org chart in a piece of paper. When I was in clinical operations and even clinical development, medical affairs, many people thought of as something that other people did, and it was a necessary evil, and you did your best to avoid working with them. And I never understood, and that was not a sharing thing. That was pretty pervasive. When I talked to my friends at other companies, that concept was pretty commonplace, and I didn't subscribe to that. I thought medical affairs had a solid place in the organization. And needed to grow, if anything, in importance. So I always made relationships when I was in operations with the medical affairs leaders in the company, and also commercial operations, because I thought that was of equal importance. And so Ken was the head of U.S. medical affairs at Merck. And so when Schering became part of Merck, I reached out to him and said, "Hey, can we develop a working relationship?" And he was pretty silent for about 10 seconds because he said, "But Michael, this is the first time anybody's ever proactively called me from clinical anything. Yeah, let's do it." And we started out with just one-on-ones with Ken and I, but eventually he invited me to his leadership team meetings. He invited me to his all-hands meetings to give presentations about what clinical does and how medical could work together with them. And I did the same with him. And it was a relationship that developed over months and years. And then the opportunity came one day. Ken called me and asked me if I could come over to his office, which was in a totally different city in New Jersey. So I drove over there, sat down with him, and he said, "I'm about to reorganize U.S. medical affairs, and I want your opinion." And I said, "Well, Ken, I've never worked in or run medical affairs before." And he says, "Yeah, but you know what it should be." He took out a blank piece of paper. He said, "Draw it for me. What should it look like?" So I drew it for him, and then when he looked at it, he started cracking up. And he opened up his drawer, and he took out his handwritten version of the same thing, and it was like 96% the same. I mean, it was unbelievably the same. So he starts laughing, and he said, "All right, which box do you want? Name it. Come do this with me."
No way.
I said, "Well, Ken, I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing." And he's like, "Well, everything you've told me, you want to be a chief medical officer." He's like, what chief medical officer has experience in clin dev and medical affairs?" He said, you've said you wanted to lead medical affairs. You got to come do this. And so I did. And I joined U.S. Medical Affairs. I ran about 40% of the portfolio for U.S. Medical Affairs. It was a great experience. But going back to Ken specifically, he's a great listener. So when you were talking to him, and Michael, you knew him well, so I'm sure you'd agree, you got the sense that he was actually listening to you. He wasn't on his phone, or looking at his laptop. He was having a conversation with you, and that was all that mattered to him at that moment. But it wasn't just that moment. He then heard what you said, he digested that, and he took action on it. So it wasn't just giving you time, it was actually listening, which is different than just hearing. And he supported his people. He supported them in their growth and development. I mean, he invested in people personally. He took his whole team to the World Business Forum in New York City. I don't know if you're familiar with that venue, but it's a really, really expensive meeting. It was in Radio City Music Hall, to give you the size of the meeting. It was thousands of dollars per person to attend, and they have speakers like Malcolm Gladwell and, really great thinkers from all different fields, not just life sciences. There were designers who talked about creativity. I mean, just really amazing things. So he took his whole team to this, and it cost a ton of money that he had to get approval for. So that's just the type of things that he did, and he took leadership and leadership principles really seriously. And like Jim Collins was his favorite person, and Good to Great, was a book that, not just mentioning and passing, but bought it for everybody, and then spent literally weeks talking chapter by chapter as a team about what it meant and how we were going to internalize that. So, I mean, just an amazing guy. I owe a lot of what I know about medical affairs to Ken.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So I don't know what else to say other than I miss him.
Yeah, me too. And, the nuggets I pull out of that story are, one, building those cross-functional relationships is really important, not only for the company, but also to build those relationships. You never know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I learned from your story about Ken is, part of the art of influence and part of doing that is helping people get what they want. And so by him saying, "Hey, you want to be a CMO, right? Well, here's the path to it." I think as a leader, sometimes you have to help people get on the right path. Yeah. And knowing what they want helps you get it on there, get them on there. But now let's circle back to Tom Havardy, because you told me something special about him as it comes to hiring people and surrounding yourself with people. Tell us about Tom.
The one thing I'll say about Tom is that really had an eye for talent, but when I say talent, I mean that in a very broadest of sense. So not just technical expertise, like that was the ticket to get in the door, but it wasn't enough to get you in the seat. For Tom, you had to be collaborative, you had to be a good communicator, you had to have the right cultural fit and dynamics, and you had to be a good person. He didn't want to surround himself with people who were a bull in a china shop. He didn't want to surround himself with people who, by all means necessary, got the job done. You had to get it done the right way, and he set you up for success and really let you do the work. So I've never met anyone who said they were a micromanager. Maybe you have, but I haven't. But Tom certainly would not be on that list. But he had his finger on the pulse at the same time in a way that wasn't intrusive, and could zero in on the 2 or 3 things that you should think about for whatever that project was or whatever that conversation was for the day, without being in the mix. You could go in and talk to him for 5 minutes about a project or an issue, and he'd give you the 2 or 3 things you need to focus on or think about. And it was really remarkable how he was able to do that, how he was able to get people behind him and behind objectives. I remember when I was in clinical, there was another therapeutic area that had a massive study going on, 10,000 patients, trying to get that database cleaned and locked in a quick way. I mean, he came in on a Friday night, with a couple of dozen pizzas, and sat, not just brought the pizza, but sat there with the team while they worked and just talked to people. I mean, who does that at an executive level? But he does, and he did, and just an amazing guy.
Well, you told me that you always said you always build great teams, and he said I'm a good picker, right?
Yeah,
surrounding yourself with people that have skills that maybe you don't, or skills that enhance yours instead of clones, can really be good. And hiring the right people is a crucial part to being a great leader. And I know firsthand that when you're hiring, you really have an eye for diversity. So tell us more how you feel that is the best practice in building teams.
So I think it's a necessity. And the reason why I say that, and it's not diversity of background or any of that. It's really diversity of thought that I'm talking about. You don't need. I used to say to the leadership team back at Schering-Plough and at Merck, if I wanted 8 people who said yes, I'd look in the mirror and talk to myself. I want everybody to come to the table with what they think is the best approach, what they think is the right way to get something accomplished, the best way to get that accomplished. And let's have a spirited discussion about it and then all align. And the only way you get that is by having people with different backgrounds, different experience sets, different life experiences. And it's a business imperative. Otherwise, you're never going to get to the best without having diversity of thought and diversity of ideas. So that's always been, what I did. And when I was forming the clinical trial operations org for North America at Schering, there were a lot of people who wanted to apply to be the directors levels of the individual regions within the United States. It was pretty fierce competition. There were, lots of people that sent their CV and I distinctly remember one person who sent me not only their resume and put in for the job posting, but sent me a long letter about why we got the structural elements of the design for the West Coast of the United States wrong. Oh. And not only did she point out what she thought was wrong, but then gave her idea of what we should be doing and why. And so when the HR business partner called me with that CV, they said, "You're probably not going to want to talk to her. She sounds like she's really difficult. She's applying for a job and telling you that you're wrong." And I said, "Can I interview her first?" And she got the job. because she was right. So she had an opinion. She expressed it clearly. She defended the position, and she was right. And we hired her, and she was wonderful. So
Wow.
that's what diversity of thought is for me, and that's why it's so important.
And that makes a lot of sense, not only in that context, but when I think about how you structure teams, you know, you're okay with, bucking the trend. Because I remember like when we were working together at Blue Sphere, you're the CMO there, you're building a whole organization, and you started targeting the hiring of medical affairs people way before any other CMO I know would. What's your philosophy on that?
So I think medical affairs is and can be a lot of different things to different organizations at different time points. And so, when most people who haven't spent time in medical affairs think about medical affairs, they're thinking about a field MSL.
Okay.
And the question of, when do you need scientific professionals available that are trained to have peer-to-peer conversations with thought leaders around the country or around the world? That's one part of medical affairs, but it's not the only part, right? Yeah. And so there are things that medical affairs can and should do in partnership with clinical development and commercial early. And so when you're a small company and you're trying to compete with mid-size and large companies, you need every advantage that you can possibly generate, and you need every tool in the toolbox that you could possibly have. Medical affairs people are up on, or can be quickly upschooled to know the scientific literature, know the lay of the land, what's happening competitively. So when I pitched bringing in people for medical affairs early at Blue Sphere to the CEO, it was with the notion that they could, number one, work in tandem with clinical development, thinking about trial designs, and then testing those thoughts externally with thought leaders, helping with competitive intelligence, because you can imagine, a small company doesn't have the resources that a large company does to really understand what the competition's up to, and why they're going the way they're going, and whether you should zig when everybody else is zagging. So medical affairs can certainly help there. And then there are other important things for the company that medical affairs can help with. They can help review clinical content that might go out either to the board of directors or externally through investor relations. So they can help, with a scientific review and a scientific lens to those communications. Because it's really important that the organization is aligned so that whatever investor relations or the CEO is saying externally has to mesh with what the clinicians in the organization are saying to potential investigators. Medical affairs can help with all of that. So while you might not need a traditional large field-based team on day one, having at least a small group that can help with traditional headquarters medical affairs activities and help with some of the things that I talked about are critical. And then medical affairs can morph and grow as the organization grows, and it should. But to not start early, I think, is a mistake.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you. I'm a little biased, of course, but I think medical affairs people are like the Swiss Army knife of pharma. In fact, sometimes when you just plug them into just medical affairs activities, these other skill sets that they have, they begin to atrophy a little bit. Yeah. And so they're so versatile, they're so competent, and they have an insatiable appetite to learn and continue to contribute. So I think you're right on with that philosophy. And as we've spoken more and more about your philosophies about medical affairs, you really brought up another fascinating idea about a role, a gap that you think is missing in pharma as it relates to medical affairs. Speak to us about that.
Yeah. So this might not be the most popular view, but from my perspective, medical affairs suffers from two things. One is people not understanding what medical affairs is and what it can or should be. And then the second thing that it suffers for is not having a proper home. And in some organizations, medical affairs reports into the commercial organization. In some, it reports in through the clinical part of the organization. And for an organization that's intended to be, among other things, the bridge between commercial and clinical, it always struck me as odd that it would report into one or the other of those things, because that's not the right balance. To me, medical affairs should be an independent voice, and at the executive level, there should be, a medical affairs head, chief medical affairs officer, or whatever you want to call it, so that they're, number one, on equal footing with their commercial partners and their clinical partners. That allows them to be independent and not have undue influence in one direction or the other, and strike the right balance, because as you know well, there's a significant compliance consideration for what medical affairs does. So maintaining that independence would help enforce that important compliance obligation and get to the right answer for that organization at that point in time.
I mean, wonderful idea. But even the fact that sometimes medical affairs reports into commercial and sometimes it reports into clinical development just shows that maybe there's a problem. Like, no one knows where the proper home is, like you said. Chief Medical Affairs Officer, maybe you'll be the first one of those, or hire the first one of those when you become a CEO. Now, some of the people listening to this would love to be a CMO one day, very similar to, how you were coming up through Schering-Plough and Merck. So what are 3 tips that you would give them about how to manage their career to make it to the CMO level?
Well, I mean, my advice is free. I don't know if it's the best advice, but what I would say is, if you're an MD, I wouldn't fall into what I call the medical doctor trap, which is thinking that your entire job, your entire reason for being is in clinical development, and in particular in the area that you trained and board certified in. It's an approach, and it's the traditional approach for chief medical officers. They trained as a pulmonologist, and then their jobs in industry are all related to pulmonary medicine, and they join a company that's got a therapeutic area in pulmonary medicine, or they join a biotech that's focused on respiratory disease. It's a very traditional path. It's defensible. It's what most people do. But I think you need to expand your horizons beyond that, both from a therapeutic area perspective and also even stepping outside of what clinical development proper has to offer. From my perspective, you shouldn't limit your roles in your career to just clinical development. And certainly, it's self-serving, because that's what I did. I moved my cheese and had my cheese moved for me, not just therapeutic area, but, in functions. Because I think that depth is really needed to understand, and the breadth to really be a chief medical officer where you're leading multiple functions. It's good to have more than a cursory understanding of what those functions do and what they can be if they're shaped properly. So that's, I think, point one for being a CMO. I'd say the other point is to not be afraid to learn from and to partner with your commercial colleagues. There's often a hesitancy to do that in clinical, and I think it's a big mistake. Unless you're an intuitively brilliant person about everything in the world, you might know your science, but bringing that science to patients in a way that people are going to want to pay for it is a different science. And you probably don't have that experience, and you probably don't have that vantage point. So working with and learning from folks in the commercial organization early, and do it in a meaningful, earnest way, not just give it lip service. At least for me, I found it invaluable. And in many occasions, the companies decided to do something different than it originally decided in terms of a development program because of that partnership and that conversation. And those decisions were actually the right decisions to make jointly. And I don't think either party, if they hadn't worked with the other party, would have gotten there on their own. So I'd say definitely that's an important thing to do. And then the third thing I would say, and you brought this up earlier, Michael, is that you don't have to be an expert in everything. And it's a mistake to think that you are. So don't be afraid to hire and work with great people who are smarter than you are. Some people are afraid of that. I'm certainly not. I like to hire great people, let them do their jobs, and then spotlight and showcase what they've done, not what I've done.
Yeah, well, that's great insight. So be able to stretch therapeutically, reach out to other departments cross-functionally, commercial being one of them, and then also surround yourself with great people.
Yep.
All right.
For sure.
Well, we've spoken about 2 books already, Who Moved My Cheese and Good to Great.
Yeah.
And as we bring the episode to an end, I love reading leadership books. It sounds like you do too. Are there any books that you've read recently that you would recommend? And then what were your main takeaway from that book?
Okay. So I read a lot. I've recently reread 2 books that are not new.
Okay.
One is Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. And the other is a book by Marshall Goldsmith that's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Yeah. Marshall's an amazing mind. He's a Fortune 500 executive coach, and I've met him personally. He's an amazing guy. Wow. All of his books, including his most recent book called The Earned Life, aren't business books per se. And they're not even leadership books per se. They're how to be a good human being books, how to be authentic, and how that translates into leadership. So it's not it's leadership tangentially, but it's more about how to lead and how to live your life. And I'd say same thing with Speed of Trust. That book applies to your personal life as much as it does to your business life. But God, I mean, those are hard hills to climb, both of those books. But if you can scratch the surface on what's in there and actually take that to heart and do it, I think you'd be successful in any business venture. So I'd say anything from Stephen M.R. Covey or Marshall Goldsmith is worth its weight in gold. But I would read his new book, The Earned Life, which is amazing, and anything by Adam Grant I would throw in there too. Give and Take in particular, but anything.
Wow. Well, thank you for those recommendations. And sadly, our time is coming to an end. So on behalf of all in the Pharmaverse, we just want to thank you, Michael, for your insights and the stories. We've all benefited from them. So again, thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.